Think about how a game of Jenga works. You see this tall, sturdy tower, and it looks incredibly stable. But the entire structure is resting on the friction of just, a few key blocks hidden near the bottom.
Right, yeah. It just takes one wrong move.
Exactly. If you pull the wrong one, the whole thing comes crashing down, and the shape of the tower is changed forever. So today, we are taking a deep dive into one of those foundational blocks in history.
A moment where a nation's entire structural integrity was basically resting on a single precarious vote.
Yeah? Welcome to the deep dive. We've got a massive stack of sources for you today. We're talking constitutional analyses, historical archives, activist accounts, and it's truly gripping alternate history paper that models a massive geopolitical what-if.
And the topic for today is the 1967 Australian referendum.
Right.
For some essential context, this vote remains the most statistically successful referendum in Australian history. The result was a staggering 90.77% yes vote across the nation.
Which is just a massive mandate.
Oh, absolutely. It carried a majority in all 6 states. When you look back at it, it's widely remembered as this unifying, inevitable triumph for civil rights.
But our mission today isn't just to look at the shiny finished tower, We are exploring the alternate timeline mapped out in our sources. We're asking the big question, what if the 1967 referendum had failed?
Yeah, it's a terrifying thought experiment.
It really is. Okay, let's unpack this, because diving into this counterfactual scenario reveals that the civil rights progress you might take for granted was balancing on an absolute razor's edge.
It really shows us just how fragile national legitimacy actually is.
Yeah, and the mechanics of why understanding that fragility matters to you right now.
Right. So to really understand how history could have broken, we first need to look at the mechanics of what actually changed in the Constitution. There is a surprising amount of mythology surrounding the 1967 referendum that we really need to clear up first.
Oh, the myths are everywhere in these sources. Like, if you stop the average person on the street, they will likely tell you 1967 was the year Indigenous Australians finally got the right to vote.
Right. Or that it granted them citizenship.
Yeah, or even that it took them out of some Flora and Fauna Act. But our sources explicitly point out that none of that is true. I mean, federal voting rights were largely achieved in 1962, and citizenship was formalized way back in 1948.
Exactly. The referendum was entirely about altering the Australian Constitution, which is a document drafted back in 1901 by people who, quite frankly, operated under the assumption that Aboriginal people were a dying race.
Wow.
Yeah. So the vote specifically targeted 2 exclusionary clauses. First, it altered Section 51, specifically Clause 26, which is known as the race power.
Right.
It deleted the phrase other than the Aboriginal race in any state.
So, mechanically, before 1967, the federal government was constitutionally banned from making special laws for Indigenous people if they lived within state borders. Like, they were entirely at the mercy of the individual state governments.
That is the core of it. The federal government had literally no jurisdiction. The second change was the deletion of Section 127.
Ah, right. This one is wild.
It is. That section explicitly stated that Aboriginal natives should not be counted in reckoning the numbers of the population.
Which just sounds so surreal today.
Yeah, they were physically counted by census takers on the ground, but they were legally erased from the official statistics used to calculate federal representation and distribute tax revenue.
So I am looking at these numbers in the archives, and I am genuinely confused. You have a proposal to give the federal government power to help people and to officially count them in the population. And it eventually gets over 90% support.
Right.
How on earth could the No campaign possibly weaponize that? I mean, it makes no sense to me how a vote this popular was ever at risk of failing.
Well, it comes down to a spectacularly risky political maneuver. Prime Minister Harold Holt's government tried to be overly clever. Yeah. They took this widely supported Aboriginal question and they tied it to a highly controversial, highly technical secondary question called the Nexus Proposal.
It's like trying to pass a universally popular civil rights bill by stapling it to an incredibly unpopular tax hike.
Exactly.
It's absolute political self-sabotage.
It really was. So the Nexus question was an attempt to alter Section 24 of the Constitution. Mechanically, the Constitution required the House of Representatives to be roughly twice the size of the Senate.
Okay.
The government wanted to break that nexus to increase the number of seats in the House without having to proportionally expand the Senate. But remember, the Senate is the state's house.
I see where this is going.
Yeah, smaller states saw this as a blatant power grab by Canberra to dilute their influence and centralize power.
So in reality, the Nexus Coalition failed decisively. Like, the voters crushed it while passing the Aboriginal question.
Right.
But the alternate history models in our sources point out a terrifyingly plausible scenario. What if the No campaign had successfully framed both questions as a single, unified federal power grab?
This raises an important question, especially when you consider the stringent mechanics of constitutional change in Australia. To pass any referendum, you need a double majority.
And that's not just a national majority, right?
Exactly. That doesn't just mean a national majority of voters. It means a majority of voters nationally and a majority of voters in a majority of states. So 4 out of 6 states must vote yes.
Wow, that is a high bar.
Extremely high. If the No campaign had convinced the smaller states that giving Canberra power over Indigenous affairs was just another part of the Nexus power grab, the Aboriginal question would have been dragged down right with it.
And a failure under that double majority system wouldn't have just been a temporary pause button. It would have locked the country into a constitutional abyss. So let's map out this alternate timeline. The year is 1967. The No campaign successfully conflates the two issues. The referendum fails. What happens the next morning?
The immediate consequence is a total legislative vacuum at the federal level. Without that amendment to Section 51, the Commonwealth remains paralyzed.
They just can't do anything.
Right. The Holt government, humiliated by a massive defeat on both fronts, would have entirely abandoned any further Indigenous reforms. And state premiers, particularly in places like Queensland and Western Australia, would interpret the no vote as a national mandate to maintain their segregationist policies.
Yeah, our sources detail the daily reality of those state policies, like the Queensland Aborigines Act. And this wasn't just abstract legal theory.
Not at all.
This gave the state the literal power to dictate where Indigenous people could move, who they could marry, and essentially control their employment.
It was incredibly oppressive.
And a failed referendum gives that entire system a constitutional green light to continue indefinitely.
Yeah, the downstream effects on modern law are just staggering. The landmark federal laws that define modern Australian human rights simply cease to exist in this timeline.
Like which ones?
Well, the Foundational Racial Discrimination Act of 1975, gone. The Commonwealth wouldn't have had the political capital or the constitutional authority to enforce it against the states.
Oh, wow.
And the Native Title Act of 1993, impossible.
Wait, I want to clarify something here, because the famous Mobo decision of 1992, which overturned the legal fiction of terra nullius, the idea that the land belonged to no one before British arrival, that was a high court decision.
Yes, it was.
So how does a failed public vote in 1967 stop judges from making a common law ruling decades later?
Because the High Court cannot invent common law that explicitly contradicts the Constitution.
Oh, right.
If the 1967 referendum fails, the foundational document of the country explicitly reinforces that Aboriginal people are excluded from the national reckoning. The High Court would have been legally bound to a document that essentially codified their exclusion.
So their hands would be tied.
Exactly. The legal bedrock required to recognize native title simply wouldn't exist.
The structural stagnation is profound. But there is a fascinating paradox I noticed in the sources regarding Section 127. I actually wanted to push back on the state's logic here, because the math doesn't add up.
Okay, let's hear it.
If Section 127 stays, and Indigenous people aren't counted in the official population reckoning, doesn't that actually hurt the states with the largest Indigenous populations? Like, wouldn't places like Queensland and Western Australia lose out on federal seats and tax revenue?
It's a brilliant observation, and the financial records in the archives validate that exact point.
Really?
Yes. Ironically, the states most resistant to federal intervention would have financially penalized themselves.
That's wild.
It is. Federal funding and the allocation of seats in the House of Representatives are distributed strictly based on official population numbers.
Right.
So by forcing a significant portion of their population to remain legally invisible, Queensland and Western Australia would have literally lost millions of dollars in per capita federal grants over the ensuing decades, and potentially sacrifice seats in Parliament.
They would be stubbornly holding on to a racist constitutional clause that was actively draining their own state budget.
Exactly.
But we have to ground this structural talk in human reality, because while politicians argue over tax revenue and parliamentary seats, the human cost of a no vote is catastrophic on a daily basis. Take the stolen wages system.
Oh, this is a critical mechanism to understand. The stolen wages system was a practice where state governments and officially appointed protectors managed the earnings of Indigenous workers.
So you couldn't just get your own paycheck?
No, an individual couldn't just access their paycheck. The state withheld the bulk of the money in trust funds, which, by the way, were frequently mismanaged or entirely siphoned off.
Unbelievable.
And then they would distribute a tiny fraction as basically pocket money.
In our timeline, the 1967 vote gave the federal government the moral and legal standing to start intervening, eventually pushing for direct payment of social services and wages, but in a no timeline.
Right, without Canberra having any constitutional power to intervene, that pocket money system persists for decades longer. The financial exploitation of generations of workers remains completely unchecked.
And when you look at that grim domestic reality, you realize that people on the ground don't just passively accept a defeat like that.
No, definitely not.
When the legal and political routes for change are completely blocked by a failed referendum, the nature of the resistance drastically changes.
Absolutely.
Here's where it gets really interesting. A failure in 1967 completely changes the face of activism. Because leading up to the vote, you had what historians call the integrationist leaders.
People like Faith Bandler and Sir Douglas Nichols.
Yeah, they spent a decade gathering petitions, organizing polite campaigns, working within the system, trying to win the respect and fellowship of white Australia.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, imagine the psychological blow of a no vote after 10 years of peaceful petitioning.
It would be devastating.
It would have utterly discredited the integrationist approach. It sends a loud, undeniable message from the Australian public saying, we do not want you.
Right.
For the younger generation of activists watching this unfold, that realization would have severed any remaining faith in the Australian democratic process.
It's basically an engine for instant radicalization. Figures like Gary Foley and Michael Mansell, who in our timeline were frustrated by the slow pace of progress after the successful vote, would have immediately pivoted to a much harder edge.
Exactly.
If the country overwhelmingly rejects your inclusion, the movement logically abandons the idea of constitutional inclusion altogether. They pivot entirely to absolute sovereignty and separatism.
Yeah, and the activist accounts in our sources outline specific examples of how this would manifest practically.
Like the Tent Embassy.
Yeah. In our timeline, the Aboriginal Tent Embassy was established in 1972 as a peaceful, highly symbolic demand for land rights on the lawns of Parliament.
Right.
But in the counterfactual timeline, that energy morphs into something far more militant. Instead of a symbolic tent embassy, the models suggest a massive 1968 national strike, characterized by a complete rejection of Australian law and institutions.
And the geography of the cities transforms, too. Take the suburb of Redfern in Sydney. Historically, it became a hub for community-controlled health and legal services.
Yeah.
But in this alternate timeline, it transforms into a militant revolutionary center. I mean, you have a marginalized, heavily policed population that has just been told by the vast majority of the country that they legally do not count. The tension on those streets would have been a powder keg.
And this intense domestic radicalization wouldn't be happening in a vacuum. To really understand the stakes, we have to pull back and look at the global context of the late 1960s.
Which was a crazy time globally.
It was the peak of global decolonization. Nations across Africa and the Pacific were gaining independence and finding their voices at the United Nations. Simultaneously, the Cold War was at its absolute height.
I picture Australia in this scenario as the roommate nobody wants to be seen with at the global diplomatic party.
That's a great way to put it.
You have all these newly independent nations celebrating freedom, and Australia shows up trying to make alliances while holding a constitution that explicitly excludes its First Peoples.
And it goes far beyond just a terrible look. It becomes a massive geopolitical vulnerability.
Right.
The sources highlight diplomatic cables showing that Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev was already weaponizing Australia's racial record at the United Nations.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he was pointing at Australia's treatment of Indigenous people to explicitly deflect from Soviet human rights abuses. A failed 1967 referendum would have handed the Soviet Union the ultimate ideological weapon on a silver platter.
They would just point at the referendum results and say, look at the West. Look at this so-called democracy that held a national vote and actively chose to mandate the exclusion of its native population.
Exactly. The diplomatic consequences for Australia would be severe and immediate. The alternate history paper draws a direct comparison to apartheid South Africa.
That's intense.
Australia would have been viewed in the exact same light by the international community. We are talking about potential UN sanctions. We are talking about immense friction within the British Commonwealth, possibly even leading to suspension.
Because think about the mechanics of Australia's foreign policy at the time. They held international responsibilities for territories like Papua New Guinea.
Right.
How do you govern a foreign territory, preparing them for independence, while operating an apartheid-like constitution at home?
You can't. The hypocrisy becomes legally and diplomatically unsustainable. You become totally isolated from all your newly independent Asian and Pacific neighbors. You cannot successfully negotiate trade deals or security treaties when your domestic policy makes you a global pariah. So true.
It's fascinating because it reveals that the 1967 yes vote wasn't merely a domestic civil rights victory. It was a desperate geopolitical necessity to save Australia's reputation and strategic alliances on the world stage. The yes vote allowed the government to project an image of a progressive, modernizing democracy to its neighbors. A no vote shatters that illusion permanently.
Completely.
So if we trace this line, the immediate legislative vacuum, the militant radicalization on the streets, the Cold War isolation, how does this alternate timeline alter the Australia of the 21st century?
Well, it completely erases the Australia of today. If a country spends the 70s and 80s as a global pariah, dealing with severe internal unrest, the political capital needed to spark a modern reconciliation movement is entirely exhausted by the time we reach the 21st century.
Makes sense.
The most profound legacy of 1967 is its power as a symbol. That massive yes vote provided the ultimate proof of concept that sustained the reconciliation movement for 50 years. It proved the public could support Indigenous rights.
Which brings us right to the very recent 2023 Voice to Parliament referendum.
Exactly. In our timeline, the 2023 no vote regarding the Voice to Parliament was seen by many as a traumatic reversal. But if 1967 had failed, the 2023 referendum would likely never have even been proposed.
Wow.
The 2017 Uluru Statement from the Heart, which was this incredibly generous invitation from First Nations people asking the Australian public to walk with us toward a better future, that statement fundamentally relies on the goodwill established in 1967.
Right.
It simply doesn't exist in a world where 1967 failed.
Because why on earth would you invite someone to walk with you when they already slammed the constitutional door in your face half a century ago?
Exactly.
The Indigenous leadership of the 21st century would have entirely abandoned any pursuit of constitutional recognition. They would have focused all their energy on international litigation, appealing directly to the UN, and demanding sovereign treaties completely outside the framework of the Australian government.
And the result is a fundamentally fractured nation. Two separate entities occupying the same continent, locked in perpetual legal and social conflict, with no shared baseline for reconciliation.
So what does this all mean? When we pull back and look at this entire alternate timeline from the drafting of the Constitution to the modern day, the big takeaway is the sheer fragility of history.
It really is.
A simple political miscalculation by a prime minister trying to pass a sneaky parliamentary change, that nexus question regarding the size of the Senate, could have plunged an entire nation into decades of civil unrest. It could have turned Australia into an international pariah and permanently destroyed its national legitimacy.
It highlights that the timeline we live in isn't preordained. The progressive milestones we read about in textbooks were never inevitable. They were built on precarious, razor-thin moments where the structural integrity of a nation could easily have collapsed if the wrong block was pulled.
And being well-informed means understanding the mechanics of that fragility. The rights and recognitions we have today aren't permanent fixtures. They are choices that have to be continuously reaffirmed.
And that leaves us with a rather provocative thought to consider, building on what we've discussed about the Cold War.
Okay.
If we acknowledge that the overwhelming 1967 yes vote was driven, at least in part, by the government's fear of looking like a racist pariah on the international stage, it forces us to look at the present. How much of today's domestic human rights legislation, not just in Australia but around the world, is actually just a geopolitical performance for the global stage rather than a genuine, localized desire for internal reform?
Wow. If the diplomatic cameras were turned off and the UN wasn't watching, would government still do the right thing? That is something to seriously mull over. Because if history is a towering structure, you really have to wonder who is paying for the building materials and who they are trying to impress.